Order. This is another session on the funding and delivery of public services in Northern Ireland. I'd like to welcome the Minister, Fleur Anderson, MP, Ciarán Hayes and Stephen Rusk. If you could just introduce yourselves and say what your role is.
Thank you very much. I'm Fleur Anderson. I'm an Under Secretary of State for Northern Ireland Office.
Hi, I'm Stephen Rusk. I am the Deputy Director with responsibility for transformation, constitution and rights at the Northern Ireland Office.
And Ciarán Hayes, I'm the Deputy Director responsible for fiscal, economy and trade issues at the Northern Ireland Office.
Thank you very much. I'll start with question number one. And what is the government's views of the state of public services in Northern Ireland?
Thank you very much. And thank you to the whole committee for holding this inquiry. I think it's really important. It's what I hear talked about by almost everyone I meet as I go around Northern Ireland. And I'm also, as a former member of a select committee, when we do reports and you wonder what's going to happen to them, to have this follow-up report on the report that you've done previously, I think is really welcome, because so many things have changed since that report as well. We now have an executive in place, and obviously most of the areas of public services are devolved. And we also have a new devolved settlement, the budget in last autumn, which gives us a different fiscal position. But we also have worsening state of public services at the same time. And that need for transformation is absolutely underlined by the situation at the moment. So just to highlight some of the areas, as you know, more than a quarter of people in Northern Ireland are currently on a waiting list. And recent reporting and data indicates that receiving medical treatment in the corridor or waiting more than 12 hours at, for example, Belfast emergency departments has become normal. That some children with special educational needs wait more than a year for the educational support they're entitled to, and that more than 80% of major cases wait in the courts backlog for over a year, and that's compared to 27% in the rest of the UK. More than half of patients in Northern Ireland wait more than a year for that first consultant-led appointment. That's more than a year of being diagnosed, saying that you need to have a follow-up treatment before you even get onto the waiting list for treatment after that. More than a half in Northern Ireland, but that's 4% in England. So that's just some of the areas that I have that I'm concerned about, and I absolutely know that the executive are concerned about this too. The executive know the mountain they need to climb. They're very aware of the challenges and the difficult decisions that they have. But I think fundamentally transforming public services will require the executive to own a difficult set of decisions. There is a new funding settlement. I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that in more detail. But the money is there, the levers and powers is there for the Northern Ireland executive to deliver. And what I hear talked about most are health, housing, childcare and education. And all of these have an impact on the economy. We have 5 missions as a new Labour government. We want to see them delivered across the whole of the United Kingdom. I am very concerned that if we don't have transformation of public services in Northern Ireland could diverge, could not have the gains that we have in the rest of the United Kingdom. So that's why the timing of this report by your committee is very important, because there's an urgency. We need to get on with this to make sure that we see those missions delivered across the whole of the United Kingdom. And then one more point on those missions. The top one is on growth. And economic inactivity levels are high in Northern Ireland, higher than the rest of the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, it's 21.8%, but in Northern Ireland, it's 28.2%. And I've asked about this as I've gone around to many different people. I've spoken to many executive ministers, many health organisations. I've spoken to Professor Bengoa about the health situation. And a lot of this economic inactivity is down to not receiving health care, but also, and so long-term sickness as well as childcare. So fixing this is a way of enabling people to be able to get back to the work that they want to do, be able to be part of the economy in Northern Ireland as much as we have the rest of the United Kingdom. So I think if we have transformation of our public services, we can see the levels of public service delivery at the same level of the rest of the United Kingdom. But why not go further? Why not? Could not Northern Ireland actually show the way in so many areas? It's the scale, the size, that it absolutely could be showing the way for the rest of the United Kingdom and leading the way instead of going behind. That's the ambition I have. But that's got to be working with, it's the executive to deliver and the United Kingdom to government to do what we can. And how I've described it is an active partnership, but I hope I can talk about more of that in the questions that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Minister, and morning, gentlemen. Minister, what's your personal involvement in negotiating the new fiscal framework?
The new fiscal framework is down to the Treasury to be negotiating. So there's parts of this that I'm responsible for, and there's parts of this that other parts of the United Kingdom government are responsible for. I can talk a bit more about that, but for us it's relaying what we hear, what is needed, supporting the Independent Fiscal Council in their assessment of need, and supporting the way that the money will be funded, for example, talking about multi-year budgets, but also making sure that those other pots of funding that there's the block grant, but there's also other pots of funding, there's community ownership fund, there's SPF funding, to making sure that the Northern Ireland voice is heard in negotiations over that.
You're not personally involved in the negotiations overall, but you have personal responsibility for some aspects of it. Is this something that is a recurring feature within your workload on a weekly basis? Are you engaging regularly on issues around fiscal sustainability in Northern Ireland?
This is welcome to my world. My whole remit, I think, is being a champion of Northern Ireland in the UK government, and then being the champion of the UK government in Northern Ireland and facilitating those connections. And I've seen it like a corridor where you have all the ministers' rooms lined up. You have a corridor, and they all open doors for the Northern Ireland Executive to work with and collaborate with. So it's not just about the economy and fiscal sustainability, but I work across with many ministers. For example, I've met with Minister Gwynne recently to talk about health. I've met with Minister Morgan to talk about education. I'm going very shortly to Northern Ireland with Minister Phillips to talk about violence against women and girls. I could go on.
When you do that, when you engage with Ministers of Health and Ministers of Education here in Whitehall, who have no departmental responsibility for Northern Ireland, are you doing that in conjunction with devolved elected representatives in Northern Ireland, or are you doing that on your own?
No, well, I have no remit to speak just on my own. So I spend my time in Northern Ireland meeting with ministers. So, for example, I met jointly recently to talk about the childcare strategy, jointly with Minister Given, Minister for Education in Northern Ireland, and with Minister Morgan, the UK Government Minister. When I'm going to Northern Ireland with Minister Phillips, I'll be meeting jointly, and we'll be meeting with Naomi Long while we're there. Very much I see this as a collaboration, because I see this active partnership as being not just going beyond funding. We provide the block grant, but this does not end there. We need to work together. We're developing new strategies. Childcare strategy, we're developing our new health strategy for the whole of for other parts of the UK. That needs to be done in conjunction. And I think there's always a risk that policy is made in Whitehall and then conveyed to the Northern Ireland Executive. But actually, it needs to be much more hand in hand. And we're seeing that already, for example, and we've talked about this before, Gavin, with the tobacco and vapes bill. I think that's a model of where legislation was done in conjunction with the devolved governments right from the beginning, and ended up with legislation that was different for the devolved areas, depending on what their remit is. And that's what devolution is. It's local people making decisions about their area. But it was done within the whole UK-wide strategy. And I hope we'll see a lot more of that as we move forward.
When do you think the negotiations on the fiscal framework will conclude?
They are ongoing. I can't say an exact date, but they are absolutely ongoing at the moment.
Whenever this process commenced, Minister, it was commenced and concluded in the first draft phase by the previous government. At that time, there was criticism of the previous government because they were not going back to the start of the CSR period. They were not ensuring that the financial losses, when need wasn't met in Northern Ireland, were being met by this government. And we criticised that, and the Labour Party criticised that. So in your role as advancing and championing the issues of Northern Ireland within government, can you give any assurance that as part of this negotiation, the backdating of need will be considered within the 3-year comprehensive spending review period? Hang on a second, Ciarán.
Yeah.
Minister.
Well, the assessment of need is done by the Independent Fiscal Council.
Yes.
So we will be pushing for them to have that, as you know, they will be reassessing that need. So that will be an important part of it. But you're going across different periods, so I think Ciarán is best placed to answer that.
It's a political question, Ciarán, because I think, yes, you have an official answer to give, but it's a political question. Labour criticised the lack of backdating within the 3-year CSR period and recognised that because the fiscal arrangements did not go back within that 3-year period, the executive was hamstrung because the executive was having to pay back money that they should never have been in debt for because need wasn't met. So my question is more a political one. Are you negotiating on behalf of Northern Ireland to ensure that the outcome of this process recognises that the fiscal need goes back within that 3-year period?
It's the Secretary of State who's responsible for that within the department, so the detail of what we are negotiating on is his with the Treasury, but Ciarán will know what we are negotiating on.
The Secretary of State's responsible. It would have been good to hear from him, I'd just say respectfully, and if the Cabinet Minister in the Treasury, Chief Secretary of the Treasury is responsible for this overarching, it would have been good to hear from him too, but thank you, Minister. Ciarán.
So if you think back to the original financial package that was done when the exec returned, the way the funding was put in place there, although at the time there wasn't a recognition from the Treasury that it should be formally backdated, the way some of the stability funding was put in place essentially mimicked what that would have been. So in actual fiscal terms, the executive has the funding that it would have had if that was in place. Now, the agreement that was...
The thing is that the executive were said, we will write off the debt that you shouldn't have in the first place, provided you provide a savings of 113 or 15 million pounds per year.
So the agreement that was put in place was the overspends that had occurred would be written off subject to a balanced budget. Now, I think we're on track for that, and I think, we've also had the publication of the Fiscal Sustainability Plan as well, which I think is a really good piece of work and a really good step forward. But
you would accept that the overspends were less than the sum that would have been delivered to the executive if need had been met?
So
there's a loss to the executive in that calculation. You'd accept that?
So based on the calculations we did at the time, the extra money that was put in, when you also include the write-off of the overspends, put the executive in the same financial position it had been if some of that money had been if the 124 had essentially been backdated in terms of the needs-based Barnett formula.
Right to the committee with that?
So happy to kind of set out more detail on that. Yeah. But sorry, just in terms of the next step of it, as we set out at the time, that would be subject for the spending review, the Department of Finance, the Treasury, working alongside us in the Northern Ireland office, obviously looking at that, and that as a matter of negotiation as part of the spending review.
Just a very quick question back to the Minister, following up from Mr Robinson's line of question. When you and the Secretary of State had that magic word shadow before your positions, you were vocal in the criticism of the stance of the previous government on this issue. Therefore, I suppose leading legitimately to the expectation that if returned to government, there would be a fresh approach mirroring, filling in the gap of the criticism that you and the then Shadow Secretary of State were making. In making that assertion, had that position been cleared with the then Shadow Treasury team, leading to an expectation that the gap which Mr Robinson has alluded to would indeed be filled as a result of change of thinking? Had there been integration in the thinking before shadow ministers were criticising a policy? Had the Shadow Treasury team said, yes, you're right, this is what we would do if we're elected? Or was the Shadow Northern Irish team trading in a vacuum?
I'm sure there was absolute integration, and there is all across all the time. I'd just like to highlight that there has been a big settlement this year. So this is what we're dealing with. This is the new situation that we are in, with the 124% figure arrived at by the Independent Fiscal Council, looking at relative need and funding that with the biggest largest settlement in real terms since the history of devolution, the government providing £18.2 billion for the Northern Ireland Executive with a £1.5 billion top-up. So behind all of these questions is there enough money? And I can see that that's behind, that's absolutely the remit of this inquiry. Is there enough money? And that assessment of need would say, yes, there is enough money. There is enough money to transform public services. That's the question. The discussion now needs to move on from funding, really, to delivery. And that's what I've heard time and time again. There have been strategy after strategy. The budget is now improved. There's been this £1.5 billion top-up through the Barnett consequentials this year, which I know who you're speaking to, the Minister for Finance next. I don't think she expected that much, and she is using it well. And now is the time, really, to say we've got enough money, but this cannot be a reason for not having the transformation of public services that we need.
Briefly, Minister, is it, the temporary use of top-ups to sort of plug gaps, etc., is a perennial problem when it comes to relationships between Treasury, the Northern Ireland Office, the Executive, and the whole of Northern Ireland. It doesn't address the fundamental issue alluded to by Gavin. About the base core assessment of need, i.e. the foundation is wrong, hence the trigger for top-ups being required. So is it your intention, is it Treasury's intention to fundamentally review the foundations?
There will be a review by the Independent Fiscal Council. There will be a review, yeah.
So as part of the phase 2 of the spending review, the reason why the needs-based kind of part was put into the Barnett consequentials was to ensure that the Executive was on a sustainable fiscal position. That was to try and move away from, as you say, the kind of top-up funding that had been done over the years. I think also crucially within phase 2 of the spending review, this is looking at a multi-year settlement, which would mean that the Executive would then have certainty on the amount of funding that would be available each year. I know if you look back in previous years, there was the money that came through the block grant, and then there was other bits on top. I think in terms of the wider fiscal strategy here with regard to the Northern Ireland Executive, it's to ensure the Executive have essentially the fiscal sustainability and the spending power in order to kind of plan effectively and to deliver public services effectively without having to rely on there may be more money coming, there may not be more money coming. And that kind of certainty, I think, is a really important point.
Great, thank you. Katrina Murray.
Yep. Thank you for your questions so far and answers so far, and I'd want to expand on the 124 percentage. And the question that keeps coming back to me when we're talking about established levels of need is, did the evaluation of the starting points of this or the formulas that determine need actually start in the right place and was based on the things that we actually need, the differences within the Northern Ireland population to actually establish the point of need? And the Fiscal Council have been incredibly clear about that, is that the answer was somewhere between 121 and 127, and even that would probably be slightly within the bounds of probability that might be odd. So they built into that the position of the multiple credible sources of information, which would change the assessed levels. Has the government received, or the Northern Ireland Office received, any of those, what would be determined as the multiple credible sources of information, that, as were explained by the Fiscal Council?
Well, the UK government will agree this detailed methodology again as well. So what the Fiscal Council will be looking at, as well as the multiple credible sources. We're receiving multiple credible sources all the time for different factors, and it's up to the Fiscal Council to say whether they in their judgment they consider them enough multiple credible sources. That's the point of it being an independent council. We receive a lot of information all the time, and I'm not going to give you a judgment here because that's for the independent council to give the judgment on.
Following on from that, overall, the Northern Ireland funding is not projected to reach 124% of relative need for another 10 years. So have you made an assessment of the potential benefits of providing more funding in the interim to bring that forward?
So I think this gets back to Mr. Robinson's previous question around what the baseline level is. As I say, under the the funding agreement that was done as part of the fiscal package to help the return of the executive, that mimics the levels of funding that would have been done under 124 if that had been done as the baseline from the start of the previous CSR period. Now, the question of whether that is carried forward in the baseline is a matter for phase 2 of the spending review. Those discussions are underway between Department of Finance, the Treasury, and we're also supporting some of that work. So if the baseline is included, that means that the executive is at 124 based on that previous assessment. That idea that it would only get up to that level over 10 years is if you don't include that funding. And so that's the comparison that's being made. But that is an issue that needs to be resolved through phase 2 of the spending review. And that's something that the Treasury and Department of Finance are actively engaging on.
And just to be clear, Northern Ireland Executive is receiving 124 according to the level of need for the next 2 years, and then we're now into negotiations for the future. But it's not going to only reach it in 10 years' time. It's receiving it.
Okay, thank you. Lee.
Thank you very much. I wanted to speak about the cliff edge and the 559 million in terms of overspends that are due to be written off. So around whether the executive can balance its budget this year, essentially. So we've heard that Northern Ireland at the moment can't move to multi-year budgets without the UK doing so. And as a previous councillor, I can very much appreciate the value of a multi-year budget. We had to exist for a long time on single-year budgets ourselves. But what plans does the government have to enable multi-year block grant settlements in future?
I do hope there will be multi-year budgets. I agree with you, and I know from my own council and from also speaking to so many community groups across Northern Ireland that multi-year funding is needed. But it's needed for certainty, for being able to plan departmental budgets into the future. It's also needed to be able to have transformation. To have transformation, we need to unlock a separate amount of the budget for transformation while delivering on day-to-day services. This is the absolute conundrum that the executive face, and I absolutely know that they understand this and they're working on this very much, and I'm sure you'll hear this from the Finance Minister coming up. So we will be aiming to move to multi-year budgets in the future.
And with regard to the cliff edge as well, so what steps has the government taken with the executive to make sure that there's no cliff edge in funding from 26 to 2027?
So that is again a matter for phase 2 of the spending review. As the Minister has set out, phase 2 of the spending review is looking at a multi-year settlement. There are obviously some issues which will need to be resolved from the current settlement into the next spending review period. But essentially, by having that multi-year settlement, that will give the executive certainty on what the block grant is going forward and being able to plan on that basis. And going back to the budget in the autumn, the settlement for the financial year 25-26 will be 18.2 billion. That is 1.5 billion more than previously.
Just one point, just to go back slightly, because obviously the writing off of the 559 million is based on the savings that have to be made. And I'm sorry, I'm just leading slightly a little bit. Actually, sorry, the next question is going to focus on that, isn't it? So I'll let it crack on.
Are you sure?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Apologies.
Okay, Dr. Alpin. Oh, yes.
Do you mind if I just focus on this, because it almost appears as if there's a blasé attitude that because there was a windfall in the budget because of spending allocations from the Chancellor, that the Northern Ireland fiscal position is in a good or a comfortable place. Is it right to say, Minister, that national insurance contributions were not factored in to the budget that's before the Northern Ireland Executive?
Well, there's always going to be changes within the year. I don't want to give any impression that we're blasé. I know the enormous mountain that the Northern Executive have to climb. I know that the challenges within each departmental budget and across the budget that there are. I'm in no way blasé about that.
One of the reasons, Minister, you'd accept that we have a need at 124 as assessed is because of the size of our public sector. And one of the issues that was live in political discourse 2 years ago was public sector pay. And you've mentioned the need to retain parity. And your party, Labour Party, were critical of the British government at the time, the Conservatives, who allocated £1.125 billion for sustainability measures and then said, we'll deal with pay pressure this year, but you can just use that money that was meant to be for sustainability for pay years 2 and 3. Now that hasn't changed, has it? And now there's additional pressure put in on national insurance. Do you understand, because I am fearful that the evidence being given is that we're now in some sort of comfortable position. It doesn't matter about the largest sum. As inflation goes, monies continue to grow too, but the pressure is there. Is there a recognition of that pressure in these fiscal negotiations? And has the Chief Secretary to the Treasury or the Secretary of State who are involved in these negotiations indicated that there's a recognition of that pressure to you?
Absolutely recognition of that pressure. Absolutely understanding the challenges we're under. I think the main message we're saying is not, oh, you've got lots of money, get on with it. The main message is there are tough decisions to be made. It is a difficult climate, but don't let that stop transformation. That's the clear message. There is enough money to think about transformation now. There has been additional top-up of the 1.5 billion. This opportunity should be used. It's not the opportunity we should sit back and say everything's great, not at all. But to say, let's not use this as a reason not to look at transformation. Transformation fiscally, to look into those budgets about how money can be saved. Transformation in terms of the model of delivery so that there are better outcomes of public services and those savings can be made by early intervention. So I think that's the caution I would have as well. But I in no way blasé. I mean, you know that across the UK we are facing these same problems as well.
Thank you, Minister. I was only raising my hand because I know my colleague wants to ask a question on transformation.
Well, don't overstep. Okay. Very keen to talk about it.
I just want to pick up on something, Minister. Do you accept then that the 124% that we're talking about level of funding is only for the Barnett consequentials at the moment? It's not for the overall block grant that Northern Ireland receives?
So the way the block grant is calculated now has the needs-based factor included into it. So that is how the block grant for 25-26 has been calculated. That is why, is one of the reasons why the block grant will now be up at 18.2 billion in 25-26. It's why there is that 1.5 billion more in there. And just to echo the Minister's point there, we completely understand there are incredibly difficult trade-offs that have to be made. There is always going to be a demand for more money to do more things, but what we believe the current funding package puts in place is the ability for the executive to make some of those trade-offs in a similar manner to devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, as well as the difficult decisions that the UK government is having to make.
Okay, Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Thank you. This isn't my question, but just picking you up on that point. So the impression might be given by your answer that the block grant that Northern Ireland receives is leads to 124% spending per person, more than the rest of the UK. Is that, in fact, what you're saying? Because we've been given the very clear impression from the organisations that we've met with so far that because of the 124% being placed on Barnett consequentials, that will take until, well, nearly, as my colleague said, nearly a decade for us to in fact reach that kind of parity of funding, or sorry, not parity of funding, but the 124% spending in Northern Ireland that is correlative with the demonstrable need.
So this goes back to the issue of what baseline are you using. So the needs-based factor is included. That was a key part of the interim fiscal framework that was signed, I think, last May. All Barnett consequentials that are done have that 124% included. Now, there is the question of, which again needs to be resolved in phase 2 of the spending review, what is the baseline figure you are using, and therefore, in what way you apply the 124% to that. But that, again, is a matter that is being negotiated as part of Phase 2 of the spending review, and it's between primarily the Treasury on behalf of the UK Government and Department of Finance on behalf of the Executive.
I do understand that. I think there's just perhaps a slippage in the way that number is being narrated, and but we're grateful for that response. It's on record.
And just to follow up on Mr. Robinson's question earlier, we're happy to write to set out some of this in a bit more detail and show how all the calculations work, if that would be helpful for the committee.
Yes. It could be very helpful for the committee. But that wasn't really the core question that I wanted to ask. I want to talk about revenue raising, because clearly the executive have this expectation placed upon them to try and find 113 million in either new revenues or savings, and the Treasury have been very clear that they think that the Northern Ireland executive should be doing more on revenue raising. Indeed, it's been made clear by the Treasury that Northern Ireland has the highest public spending per person in the UK, but also the lowest level of revenue raising in the UK. So the pressure is on. And so my question is, what conversations have taken place with the executive about revenue raising measures that are viable in Northern Ireland?
Well, again, these are being held by the Treasury directly with the Northern Ireland Executive, and I'm glad you're speaking to the Minister for Finance after this. It's very much a devolved matter. This is a political decision for the Executive to make, and so I am not going to... I know that the potential options that are had, so the discussions we are having are about the need to raise that revenue and having a budget sustainability plan. And the Minister for Finance has made great progress on that, and we really welcome the Executive's budget sustainability plan. It's a necessary step towards delivering public finances. It's welcome to see the Executive progressing on their commitments agreed through the fiscal framework that go alongside those. And they are raising the £113 million in locally generated revenue by 25 to 26 to ensure that write-off. So there are really positive steps. I'm not going to sit here and say what I think which should be used, because that's the point of devolution. They should be looking at the budget. But I think this must be part of the conversation. If you're seeing the difficult situation that public services are in, and there are possible ways to raise revenue, that's part of the difficult part of being a politician.
Thank you. And I understand the difficulties that you may face in answering that question because of the devolved nature of those decisions. But on that subject of devolution then, perhaps something that you can answer, are there active conversations happening between you and the Northern Ireland Executive about deepening that fiscal devolution, giving more powers to the Northern Ireland Executive, in the same way that Scotland and Wales might have greater fiscal autonomy?
They have full fiscal... What did you say there, Ciarán?
Sorry.
In short, they have the powers they need. These are decisions that they need to make. There is devolution of the full fiscal framework, so it's up to them to make those decisions. So any negotiation of that would be to change the means of devolution. No, the devolved settlement is there, giving them all the powers and levers. And that's why I think when we talk about transformation, we say, is there the political will in place? Yes, I think there is. Is there the finance in place? Yes, there is. Are there the levers that are needed to make those changes? Yes, there are.
Noted. Right, thank you very much.
Just on that, not to be difficult, Chair, one of the recurring issues that come up when we're engaging with organisations on how they raise revenue is that if they are non-government bodies, if they're non-government departmental bodies, arm's length bodies and so on, they have more flexible ways in which they can borrow off books, but it isn't off books because it sits on their departmental balance sheet. And there are a number, and it's always ad hoc, it's always piecemeal coming forward saying, can we have a change of definition in ONS guidelines? Can we be considered differently? Can we borrow in a way that assists in the delivery of public service but doesn't damage the balance sheet consideration of their sponsoring department? Is that under active consideration?
It is, yes. So I have spoken directly with Northern Ireland ministers about this for different areas of work, and it is under active consideration. We want to be able to unlock the finance enabled to provide for better outcomes in public services, and about how that's done is under consideration. Whether or not they will have a great outcome in all of them, I can't guarantee, but it is.
So Does that mean that in all of them they're all still being considered on a piecemeal basis rather than a structured conversation with Treasury about how some of these bodies could borrow in a way that doesn't damage the sustainability of the department's budget?
All of these conversations are with the Treasury as well, so it's very much joined up conversation.
Sorry, if I come in briefly there. The discussion around kind of borrowing powers and all of that is part of the negotiations between the Treasury and Department of Finance on the full fiscal framework. So we've had the interim fiscal framework. Obviously, government borrowing is incredibly tight. Borrowing by the executive counts towards UKG borrowing as well. But there are discussions underway as part of that full fiscal framework negotiation of how, for example, borrowing powers for bodies that sit below Northern Ireland executive departments, how that borrowing would be classified and how it would actually kind of work towards things. And again, if you go back to the kind of fiscal package that was done to support the return of the executive, the level of borrowing that the executive could do was increased as part of that as well. But I say that that is all part of the negotiations around the full fiscal framework.
Okay, thank you. Daniel Aldridge.
Thank you, everybody. We did inherit a tragic financial situation and a crisis in public services across the United Kingdom and really acutely in Northern Ireland. So I understand, and I think we all understand, the operating context within which the decisions all of you are having to take, and I don't envy it at all. I think we have, it feels like last chance saloon when it comes to public service transformation. We have to get it right now, and we have to do it now, and difficult decisions need to be taken. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is around what that looks like realistically. What are the deliverables? I am a project manager in a previous life, so I want to know what the Gantt chart looks like. I want to know what deliverables and by when, so that the public can start to see what public sector transformation really means, because actually it sounds great, but what does it mean, and what does that look like for you?
It's a great question. I'm also come from a project management background. I want to see outcomes. We all do as well, don't we? We want to see the outcomes that are best for people in Northern Ireland. So absolutely driving that transformation forward. I think that's some of the thinking behind two aspects of this. One is the transformation board, and then one is the work with different departments and them working in collaboration, what this active partnership actually means with different ministers. So to give some examples, so I've engaged with Minister Gwynne at the Department for Health and Social Care in the UK government, and with Minister Nesbitt, the Minister for Health in Northern Ireland Executive, and said to Minister Nesbitt, in what ways can we collaborate? What would it look like to have an active partnership? And he has outlined some ways in which there can be an exchange of expertise between the UK Health Department and Northern Ireland. And I think that's what we've got to be looking at a lot. It's about looking at best practice, sharing that best practice that we can see in Northern Ireland with the rest of the UK, and sharing the best practice the other way as well, and across the four nations. There are meetings, for example, between the four nations and regions on health, on education, on different areas with the relevant ministers for each department. And I want to facilitate this as much as possible, but also I don't want to get in the way of any ministers meeting up with each other and getting solutions. And that's what we're seeing already. We're seeing it's not me saying, can you meet together? There is a lot of that, but there's also a lot of work going on between the education ministers meeting up and saying, how can we share best practice? Is there an expert in one area? Have you seen something that really works here that we can share and build on? Because innovation is the heart of transformation, I believe. You've got to really spot the places where this happens. And I've met with lots of health organisations across Northern Ireland, of which many have said to me, look, there are frontline workers, and in all of this, I pay absolute tribute to all of our public service workers who are working so hard, whether it's in health, education, housing or justice. And they have many of the answers. Where can we spot that across the whole of the UK to take that best practice and learn across the whole of the UK? In this new health strategy, for example, that's being developed by Wes Streeting, the Secretary of State for Health, how can we build in what is needed in Northern Ireland to work alongside that? in no way taking away from devolution in this. It's a way of working on active participation, which takes the best from each and moves forward faster. And there's a lot of synergy between the two, so from hospitals to communities, prevention, and using tech. And in each one of those, there are deliverables. The deliverables you and I are both looking for to say, what are the actual crunchy things that we can work on? I want I want to be able to keep looking back and saying, because we met together and worked together, this happened better. I want to be able to see that. And that's the only way that we actually see delivery in Northern Ireland, because I think there have been a lot of strategies. When I talk to people, they say, we've got a lot of strategies. And I really welcome the new strategies that are coming up. So Minister Given for Education has got a special educational needs strategy. Minister Nesbitt has the health strategy. But they have to work in tandem with the strategies being delivered across the UK. So there's a bit about policy making, there's a bit about actual delivery, there's a bit about actual expertise. And as a result of Mike Nesbitt coming to me and asking for support, there have been experts, health experts, working alongside trusts in Northern Ireland to work on that. And I just think we should all work together and strive for the best outcomes and change wherever we find that. I think you might be asking me more questions about the Transformation Board, but that's the other area of work that I see this happening in.
Stephen, Ciarán, did either of you want to come in on that? Or you? No? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I will ask about the Public Sector Transformation Board, but I think one of the things that's, that you said earlier about that divergence, the potential for a kind of, use the word tragic, again, divergence where the rest of the UK, or at least in England, follows our route of digital transformation partnered with the public sector transformation. What steps are you taking to make sure that the Assembly is going to be taking the opportunities that the UK government is pushing for around digital transformation of public services?
I think digital transformation is really fundamental to the whole changing the model, that whole part of transformation. So this is actually linked to the Transformation Board, because one of the aspects of the Transformation Board is a digital landscape review, by which we mean looking at how we can use digital to transform the different areas of public services. So it's a specific area of the Public Sector Transformation Board's work, is to look at that across different sectors. So in the development of the Public Sector Transformation Board, there were many projects put in for different areas of public services, but there were quite a few digital projects were put in, and they have been put together in terms of let's look at digital across the piece. So so health obviously stands out in one area. For example, looking at use of medicines. So I went to visited a health-related logistics company last week in Northern Ireland, and they were saying, according to them, £18 million worth of medicines are wasted each year in Northern Ireland because they expire before they are given to the people who need them. So by just transforming that will be a bit of tech, it'll be a bit of logistics, it'll be a bit of trusts working together, and the political will to do this and insist on delivery. That will be a model that potentially could change that figure. And I think it's drilling down to that level of working out where AI can deliver on this. And I'm really heartened that is a specific part of the Public Sector Transformation Board's work too.
Thank you, Minister. I think it should be on record that I wasn't the first person to raise AI in this room.
First time ever.
I think there's a hell of a lot of pressure on the whole UK about public sector transformation, but really the pressure is on Northern Ireland to deliver. Do you think, I suppose this is to the three of you, do you think that the money allocated to transformation, the £47 million a year, is that sufficient to achieve tangible change? And if not, how do we support that if it's not about more money? How do we facilitate that?
So first of all, about 47 million a year, I think that, and also you can ask the Minister for Finance about this, but I think there's been conversations about actually not having that, dividing the total pot by 5 and allocating it by year. Actually, I think we need to front load some of that money. So I hope that we'll be seeing that, because more of it needs to be spent sooner in order to get the transformation. And what was the other part of your question?
what else could we do if it's not really enough money?
Yeah.
I mean, I get that the fiscal challenges everywhere. What else can we do, and can this committee contribute to that?
It's a really helpful amount, and I hope will be helpful not only for the money that's provided, but also for the conversation that's going to be had by when the full board is set up, and I hope that will be by the end of this financial year, the full board of experts who will be talking about public sector transformation across the board. So it's not just about allocating a pot of money. It's not a funding body. It's going to be a body of experts who will be able to look at the whole piece of transformation and give a sort of another layer of support to the executive for doing that. So on its own, it's not enough. But is it some money towards kick-starting both additional funding that's needed to say that is specifically not for day-to-day funding, it's for changing your model of delivery while you do the everyday? It's helpful, but it's not going to be sufficient in its own terms. There needs to be a much wider conversation in each department. So it was never going to be what's your total bill for transformation, and this is going to meet it, but it's going to be let's have a conversation in a bit of a different way, because the executive has not been up and running for so long, so much of its existence, 40% of its existence, there are inevitably some problems with delivery. And so there needs to be different ways of working, and let's try everything. And I think that the Transformation Board is one example of let's try this, let's add this additional support to the executive. But there's going to need to be much more transformational funding support within each department as well.
Okay, Simon Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, music to my ears as a keen devolutionist, but I've always had a concern that the devolves are inclined to often sort of trade in splendid isolation of operation and never think to reach out and ask questions of each other and back to Westminster. So it's good to hear you're driving forward this sharing of best practice. But as we all know, success has many fathers, and failure is an illegitimate orphan. Will you also drive, on the other side of that coin, trying to encourage debate and discussion between the devolves and indeed Whitehall of where transformation initiatives have been undertaken, they haven't quite landed where people had hoped, the key learnings through failure, because that's as important to share to make sure that mistakes aren't repeated and duplicated?
It's a really good point. It's certainly something I've done in different roles that I've had, the importance of doing that. It's much harder in politics than it has been in previous roles that I've had in life, for sure, but I think it is really important. We need to have some honest discussions. And that's, I think the helpful way of talking about that is when we talk about innovation. And if you have truly innovative projects, then there needs to be a sort of a failure rate built in.
Yes.
And a learning from those failures and then building on that in new iterations. So I hope that the transformation is quite a well-worn word as well. So I'm really glad you're as a committee coming back to it. But what do we really mean by it? If it can have part of it can be truly innovative. You're saying to those people on the front line, say consultants, say brilliant teachers who are struggling with special educational needs provision in their school, you're saying you know the best, you try it out, but tell us when it doesn't work and let's build that in. So I do think that's important, but you'll know how challenging that is. But yes, it's important to raise.
And in an earlier answer to a question, you told the committee that you were convinced that the political will, the local political will, was there to deliver transformation. And I think you're absolutely right to point to the unhealthily long time that the executive hasn't been sitting, and therefore the backlog of transformation is actually artificially distorted, isn't it? Because just because of that. Political will is one thing, but what's your assessment from the conversations that you're having, and how do you define, or how do you see your role, and indeed that of the Secretary of State, of building mutual political trust between the political parties? Because each can have will, but if they don't trust each other to arrive at the right sort of position, the transformation bandwagon is likely to have a rather stop-start, if at all moving, journey. And in that perpetual trade-off between underpinning and buttressing the executive and Stormont functioning, that's quite important to continually, through the NIO, build those conversations of trust we're all in it together in driving forward the transformation that actually most people in Northern Ireland, certainly in conversations I've ever had, are all too readily grasping and just can't understand why politicians are a bit sort of slow on the uptake.
I absolutely agree. Trust is an essential part of this. So I think this goes two ways. First of all, the UK government working with the executive, and I think the Prime Minister leading from the front and having a conversation with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister in his first couple of days of office didn't only just start off the way we work, but also has been followed through by lots of different ministers, for example, along the way. I met very, very early on with the First Minister and Deputy First Minister and with the Deputy Prime Minister as well. So at all levels of the UK government working together is being built in, and I seek to strengthen that in my role with the Northern Ireland office. I think that's part of our role. And then it's establishing trust between the parties and between the different departments as well. And that collaborative approach, we only seek to support wherever we see it. And I think the First Minister and Deputy First Minister in leading as the executive, but also enabling cooperation between the departments is really important. The Minister for Finance's role in enabling to do that, because she has the budget, so enabling departments to work together. But then I think an example of that is in the Child Poverty Task Force that I'm on. That is a policy that's absolutely key. We have to deliver on tackling child poverty if we're really going to stand up as politicians and say we're worth our salt. But it means working across different departments. And so working on that strategy, it's being led by Department for Communities, but working together in the Northern Ireland Executive's anti-poverty strategy. And I really hope that will be a way of showcasing how we can deliver between UK government departments, but also between the executive departments. And ultimately, delivery will be the way of showing this, won't it? So if we can all enable those conditions for success, each of our different roles that we have in that, then I think that will be more stabilising for the executive, but also enable the departments to work together and the parties to work together even more effectively.
Thank you, Jo.
Could I possibly just do a quick supplementary on one of the health
quickly,
things? Just really quickly. Thank you, Chair, for indulging me. Minister, you spoke about the health thing very, very briefly earlier in response to an earlier question. We have a very unique situation in Northern Ireland where we do need to do transformation. As Simon has said, the public understand that. They are now grasping that. But we already have a situation where we have, for example, children in the north using the cardiac centre in Dublin. We have a cancer centre in Derry that's used by people on a cross-border basis. Do you think there is more scope for things being done on an all-island basis in a way that is just further continuing that north-south cooperation that we've always had? If we're trying to reconfigure services and make sure that people are getting the best services with what we have, is there not an argument to say, actually, if you're in a border county, would it not be better to actually do more on that all-island basis, which isn't a departure, it's not new, we have the cancer centre, we have the children's cardiac centre. Do you think there's a conversation there?
I think we need to look at every way in which we can improve outcomes for people to, if anyone's on that long waiting list, however we can solve it, I think that's what we should be working as politicians to achieve. So there are those examples of all-island health strategies should actually absolutely be built on. We recently had the British and Irish Intergovernmental Conference when the Secretary of State and I met in Dublin, and we talked about public service transformation in that conference deliberately to bring this to the forefront. I think wherever we can have that is absolutely beneficial to all. I was in Fermanagh talking about this as well, for them geographically to look at where healthcare provision should be, when it should be a specialised subject service further away, when it should be those provisions that are needed nearer rather than having to drive long distances. They should all be on the table. Everything that we can improve the outcomes should be on the table, and I think all-island strategies are important. The one that's been raised most with me is an all-island cancer strategy, so that's what I've been raising as well.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. Minister, I want to ask you about the voluntary sector, and I think everywhere it plugs some of the gaps maybe that between government services, but I think particularly with those years of stop-start government, it really did have to step up in Northern Ireland, and a bit of a sense of abandonment by the political class, and there were a few fairly dicey moments for voluntary sector bodies where there wasn't anybody in control of local budgets, and things weren't aligning. So funds like Shared Prosperity and Levelling Up were obviously really good for some organisations and some success stories. But there was a sense of, because the same governance arrangements didn't exist for Northern Ireland and there wasn't an executive, really quite some distance between decision making and communities, and effectively under the last government, ministers in London picking winners and losers. Just one example, Foyle is by many measurements the poorest region or the poorest constituency in Northern Ireland, but only got 3.5% less, in fact, of the funding. How are you working with the voluntary sector to try and make sure there's a little bit more prioritisation and maybe place-based engagement to make sure that really those funds, where they are, coming directly to organisations and maybe bypassing some of the budgetary black holes, that they are aligned with local priorities as well?
Well, as you may know, Claire, I come from the voluntary sector, so my absolute passion is within seeing this, and I do see this as part of public service delivery. So I'm glad you're raising this within this conversation, because, as you say, they are often picking up the pieces, and often when we talk about cliff edges of the devolved government's budget, it's even worse if it's a cliff edge for a voluntary sector organisation, because that can actually mean the project starting and closing. Whereas the devolved government will know that there will be a budget in the future. For voluntary sectors, it can be even more alarming. And also, it's not good value for money to be supporting a really good project, to be building up the trust, to be working with people, setting up, getting great people in to work with them, and then for them not to know if that's going to continue when you could be having a gap of funding and then it starts again. That really damages the project. So it's another area in which the Northern Ireland office is a convening role, because a lot of this money comes from other UK government departments. But I have absolutely been working with the other ministers, for example, with Minister Norris from the MHCLG department, who has come over to Northern Ireland. We've done a visit and we've met with voluntary sector providers. When the Secretary of State for Education came to Northern Ireland very recently, we met with in the Atlas Women's Centre to meet in a voluntary community centre to meet with women there and talking about budgeting and child poverty. Yeah. So taking the opportunity to introduce those and make those connections is one way I'm working on it, but also looking at the future of those funding pots. Could some of them be consolidated? Are they confusing? Are there just lots of different pots? How much is the onus on those voluntary sector organisations for the red tape? Because if it's too much red tape to apply for and then too much red tape to do the monitoring, when you're a small organisation, that can be a disproportionate amount of burden on you. So that's important. Multi-year budgeting, I know that it's a preoccupation of this committee and I welcome that. That's really important for community funding as well. So we've got the Community Ownership Fund, which has just given out some money for different projects, and I went with Saoirse to one of those last week. We've got the Peace Plus funding, we've got the UK SPS and the future of those. So I think it's looking at, and there's a new fund as well for support for community organisations. And so I am playing my part by looking across all those bits of funding. Do they join up? Do they incorporate the fair funding principles that have been developed by the Northern Ireland voluntary sector, which I think are very good principles? And also, can we look at how they are delivering alongside this transformation of public services?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
No worries. The last word then, Mr. Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, Minister, encouraging to hear that. Can I just press upon you the importance of delivering that strategy of stability of funding, particularly for those organisations in the community working with young people? Very often it's stopping people getting into criminality, antisocial behaviour, etc., and disruption in that when they've finally built an element of trust and engagement with those young people. To see that fractured as a result of uncertainty of budgeting really sets that process back. There are a lot of calls on the money, I know, but can I just make a particular plea for those focusing on young people, often in deprived and disadvantaged areas, who are too often tempted to go down the wrong road?
I absolutely agree with that, and it's been absolute privilege to visit some of the organisations that you're mentioning there and to talk with young people. And I've really made a point of asking to speak to young people at every opportunity I can. I used to be a youth worker, and I know how difficult it is sometimes. It takes a bit of extra effort to talk to young people. They're in school at the time, you know, I'm around visiting sometimes, but I'm determined to do that, and I have done so far. And later this week, I will be talking to the Northern Ireland Youth Parliament as well, and building their voices really need to be built into all of these conversations as well. So your funding point is very well made and understood and agreed, but also the point about bringing young people's voices into all of this conversation. They are a lot of the service users that we are talking about. They are the ones talking about the real need, dire need for mental health provision where they are. They are the ones talking who are at the sharp end often of caring responsibilities for people who are long-term sick. They are the ones in education and needing this reform. But often their voices are missed out of this conversation. So I am doing my best to ensure that they are not. And I know that other ministers are. So, for example, talking to education ministers, they are building this in as well. It's important to listen. And then not listen tokenistically as well, but listen and really understand and build that into our work. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you, Minister.
As a former teacher, I can completely agree with what you're saying, but Gavin wanted to come in, so I'm just going to allow it.
Thank you, Chair, Minister. Just so it's not tokenistic then, you will be aware that the spring budget allocated £2 million to a education skills centre on the Shore Road in North Belfast, a deprived area of the city of Belfast. It was paused by MHCLG. The Deputy Prime Minister is now minded to end that funding and not allocate £2 million to a much needed skills centre for education on the Shore Road. She is consulting. Will you, having indicated that you have picked up the mantle for many groups and many aspirations, pick up that mantle for the skills centre on the Shore Road and make sure that they get the money that was allocated to them in the spring budget?
Well, I will take that up. Thank you for raising it here. I will take that up. We've been talking about difficult decisions. I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but I will certainly take that up. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to our panel of witnesses today. Order, order. I'm now going to suspend the sit-in while we get the screen. Order, order. This is the second panel of our funding and delivery of public services in Northern Ireland session. So I'd like to welcome the Minister for Finance, Ciarán Archibald, Neil Gibson, the Permanent Secretary, and Joanne McBurney, the Budget Director. Could you please say who you are and introduce yourselves, please? We'll start with the Minister.
Hi everybody, I'm Kiva Archibald and I'm the Minister for Finance.
Neil?
Good morning everyone, I'm Neil Gibson, the Permanent Secretary, Department of Finance.
I'm Joanne.
Good morning, I'm Joanne McBurney, the Budget Director in the Department of Finance.
Okay, well thank you for your time today. My question to you, Minister, is what is the Executive's view of the state of public services in Northern Ireland?
Well, good morning everybody and thanks for the opportunity to update you on our public finances. I think the financial challenges that are facing the Executive are very well documented. It's clear also from the significant funding that was provided in the Chancellor's autumn budget that the Executive is not alone in facing those challenges and increasing demand and rising delivery costs for public services. Harm has been done to our public services by years of austerity, and that was never going to be reversed by one budget. So in my view, public services in England have also been underfunded for some time, and this therefore has reduced the funding that is provided to the Executive and to the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales. And there is a real need to properly fund public services across the board. The Executive fully recognises the need to deliver public services as efficiently and effectively as possible, and we are all in agreement that transformation is essential if the Executive is to put our finances on a sustainable footing. But to be able to do that, we need to have fair and stable funding. In May last year, I signed the interim fiscal framework on behalf of the Executive, and it was a first step in that direction and has so far delivered an additional £431 million for public services across 2024-25 and 25-26. I think more is needed to ensure that the Executive doesn't fall below its assessed level of need. And I know when Sir Robert Choate of the Fiscal Council gave evidence to the committee, he referenced the potential cliff edge in 2026-27. That needs to be avoided. The interim fiscal framework, when we signed that, recognised that concern about the cliff edge and it agreed to review and discuss the Executive's funding approach, including our concerns about 26-27 at the relevant spending review. And so my department has been working to develop the evidence base to demonstrate the need for a higher level of funding to inform the upcoming spending review for 26-27. And I'm very pleased to tell the committee that Professor Jerry Holtham, who is very well respected and led the Holtham Commission in Wales, has agreed to conduct an independent review of the North level of need. I think it's important that as representatives in Westminster, that you understand the implications of decisions that are taken by the British government for people here in the North. And in terms of the impact on public service delivery, there were a number of adverse decisions that were taken in the autumn budget, for example, in relation to agricultural property relief, the reduction in shared prosperity funding, and the particular concern is the increase in employer national insurance contributions, which will prove incredibly challenging for local businesses, for our community and voluntary sector that I heard being discussed in the previous panel, as well as for us as public sector employers, including our local councils. And I'm sure we'll get on to talk about that in more detail. But the estimated additional cost to departments and their agencies is around £200 million for 2025-26. And that doesn't include costs facing healthcare providers and our local councils. And the Executive, like the devolved governments in Scotland and Wales, do not have the financial capacity to compensate for those decisions made on reserved taxation matters. And while the Chancellor has said that there will be support provided for public sector employers, it is likely to fall far short of what is needed for us in the Executive, possibly by in the region of £100 million. So I've obviously been engaging with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in relation to that particular point to ask for urgent clarity on the quantum of funding and to ask for those costs to be met in full, and also to appeal for consideration to be given to support for those who are outside central government but who support us to deliver vital public services. So I think no doubt that the financial outlook for our public services does remain incredibly difficult. But I think as an executive, what we would say is it's also important that we give people hope, that we build on the progress that has been made since the executive has come back. And I think that the message that I would give to the committee is that the executive is very committed to working together to address the challenges that we face and to deliver for all of the people that we collectively represent.
Minister, I was just interested to hear you say that Jerry Holtham is going to do a review for Northern Ireland. When will that be happening? What's the time scale?
So that is a piece of work that is part of the ongoing negotiations in relation to our fiscal framework. And in preparation for the upcoming spending review and what I mentioned there previously about our concerns in relation to that cliff edge being addressed at the relevant spending review, which is the one that is coming up in June. That work is very timely. So we are and departments have been working along with my officials to provide additional evidence to support the case that we would make that our level of need should be higher than 124. The interim fiscal framework said that if independent credible sources supported that, then the Treasury would engage again in relation to that particular point. So we are working on providing that evidence base. I think the significant point that I would also make in relation to the interim fiscal framework and that cliff edge that we are potentially facing is that that was written into the interim fiscal framework that we as an executive would continue to plan on the assumption that we will be funded at or above the 124 level of need going forward. So it's important that we make some progress, particularly in relation to the methodology in relation to the level of need, but also in providing that evidence base that our level of need is higher than 124. Neil might want to come in and say something in relation to the timeframes, because I know officials are continuing to engage with Professor Holtham in relation to that piece of work.
Okay, Neil?
Yes, indeed. It's sort of breaking news that we've been able to secure his services. As the Minister has said, it will be in time for the spending review considerations. We can't be too precise on exact delivery dates. It'll depend a little bit on exactly what work we as officials will be supporting him, providing the evidence data that might be needed. So we'll be tying down the precise delivery dates, but it will be in time to be considered as part of the spending review process coming up in June.
Okay, thank you very much. Gavin Robinson.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, Minister. Good morning, Neil and Joanne. Just, if you don't mind, Minister, if I just follow up on that, particularly, Neil, when you say that it'll be ready in time for the spending review considerations, how does that tie in with the conclusion to the negotiations on the fiscal framework?
Yes, it's going to be quite a tight time frame, Gavin, and we're going to have to work very much in collaboration with our UK colleagues. There is still some clarity on what's in, what's out, more detailed methodological questions that will be required. So it is going to be somewhat of a sprint. But what we do know from Professor Holtham's work previously, and indeed our engagement with Treasury on a number of matters, it's also the case that we want a formula that is easily understandable. So the level of sort of complexity of econometric work or the like wouldn't be within the scope of this piece of work. So I have confidence that it is doable, but I wouldn't want to be under any illusions of just how significant the sprint will be for both Professor Holtham and indeed for our officials. Delighted that it is indeed someone such as Professor Holtham who has both reputation and experience in this area, meaning there'll be a very little lead-in time in terms of familiarity with any of the data or concepts that we'd be providing. So confident it will be done to meaningfully inform, but not under any illusions about just how hard that body of work will be for the team here.
And if I could just add to that, Gavin, officials in the department have been engaging with other departments to gather that evidence to support that case over the past number of months, and have been engaging in ongoing discussions with Treasury officials, both in relation to the relative funding per head methodology, but also in relation to that mechanism around the needs-based funding. So yes, it's something that we're very focused on, and there is a tight time frame, but I think it is important that that piece of work is delivered.
Yes, Minister, forgive me, I was just asking Neil just because he was answering that lastly, but I mean, feel free to answer this if you're more appropriate. Is this work that Jerry Holtham is going to conduct separate and distinct from the needs assessment conducted by the Fiscal Council? Is it going to sit alongside that work? Will you deal with an alternative analysis if what he provides is different and distinct from that which already exists from the Fiscal Council?
So Neil might want to come in and add to this, but my understanding was the Fiscal Council used that methodology that Holtham used to support their work in an undertaking and providing the range that they did in relation to our level of need. So what we have tried to do, Gavin, is to add to that evidence base and to provide some additional data that will support making the case for our level of need to be higher. Neil, do you want to add to that?
Yes, Minister, thank you for the question. One of the important pieces of work here will be absolute transparency on the calculations and work involved, respecting the independence of the Fiscal Council, and indeed Professor Holtham, who will also act independently, will be making sure that there's clarity in terms of the spreadsheets, the data that's used, clearing any of that information, making sure that both Treasury colleagues, Fiscal Council, and indeed Professor Holtham are working from the same evidence base, same data, and we'll be able to make sure that that's easily understood. So we do think there will be, I think Sir Robert Joe mentioned in the previous session, that there are often ranges or variances. Indeed, the Fiscal Council themselves talked about the potential band. So it is likely that we'll have a range of evidence to deploy here, but we will be working from a common base that we will be sharing and making sure that our Fiscal Council colleagues and Treasury and Professor Holtham all working from the same evidence base, that we all are clear on exactly what's being considered and what is not.
Thanks, Neil. I want to come back to you on a spreadsheet question in a moment, but Minister, what is your current involvement in understanding of the progress being made in your negotiations on the fiscal framework, and when do you believe those negotiations will conclude?
So there are, I guess, a number of pieces of work under that kind of heading of fiscal framework, and the most urgent is in relation to that level of need and to get the methodology and the mechanism in place. So officials have been engaged with Treasury officials, and I have obviously been engaged with the CST over the course of that. But given the fact that there is a deadline in relation to that particular piece of work to have it concluded in advance of the spending review, that is where the bulk of the focus has been on. As you will know, there are other elements to the fiscal framework as well, around things like budget management tools, and even the principles of fiscal devolution, which we see as the next iteration and piece of work that would be undertaken as part of that fiscal framework negotiation. So I think that we have very clearly put the emphasis on getting the level of need work done, because that is going to be the bit that's really important for the upcoming spending review, and which will of course set our budget for the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Minister, and can I thank you for coming to the committee, because the Chief Secretary to the Treasury has yet to accept and has at this stage declined. So we value the fact that you're willing to talk to us about this issue at this time, and as a committee we want to be helpful in that process. Neil, did you see the session just immediately before this one?
Parts of it, yes.
Did you see Ciarán Hayes talk about his understanding of the overspend that was accumulated when need was not matched? And his
no, I didn't hear that particular item. Apologies, Gavin.
Well, the suggestion was that whenever a deal was reached back in December of 2023 and then culminated in the interim fiscal framework, that the executive is in the same position as it would have been had need been backdated to the start of the CSR period. And my understanding is that that is incorrect, and that whilst he is looking and talking to the figures of overspend, that is different from the figures that should have been accrued had need been paid from the start of the CSR period. So I was going to ask you, if not immediately available, then please write to us, but for your view as to whether that is an accurate assessment or whether that was a misleading indication to this committee.
Yes, happy to provide a little bit more detail, but in essence you had that particular year in which there wasn't a financial package in place, and our estimates at that time. Now, I do caveat this by saying there isn't absolute transparency. That's what we're working on at the moment with Treasury as to what would be in an official calculation, what's counted within a need or a baseline figure. So I do caveat it with that, but certainly our evidence was that for that particular year, we would have been below if we consider 124 to be the need, and there are question marks around that. Then you have to ask the question about what do you consider in scope when you're measuring against the need for the years that then follow. So, for example, is the package that was provided, if you like, a one-off top-off of cash? Does that materially take you above a level of need? Yes, if we measure it to 124. But that's a very different thing in terms of baselining funding as to what decisions you can make if you don't have the surety of that going forward. So it is relatively complex, but it certainly would have been our assessment that for that 1 year in which we did slip below what had been measured need, when there was no fiscal package in place, and other previous fiscal packages had run out, and therefore there was that year that on our calculations we would have slipped below that particular level. As I say, caveated by the fact that it does slightly depend exactly what you, and we are partly making that estimate on the same basis as the Fiscal Council, with absolute full transparency of what would be in and out from a Treasury perspective.
Well, thank you. With no notice, I think that was helpful, and for the purposes of this inquiry, it would be useful if you could write, just as I asked Mr. Hayes to write to us as well.
That would be really useful. Okay, Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much, Minister and others. And I know colleagues are going to come back on the issues around fiscal framework and negotiations with Treasury. But I just wanted to look at some of the items in the draft PFG and budget. And I think everybody has sympathy for the challenges in those. But for example, the programme for government says that childcare and housing are priorities. Are they being funded at the same level as is being allocated in the UK budget?
Joanne might want to come in and speak to the Barna consequentials that came across in relation to particular items. And I think it's important, I suppose, to put that in the context of the challenge that faces us as an executive in setting the budget. So in relation to the funding that we had to allocate in the 2025-26 budget, I had 3 times as many bids for the resource and 2 times as many bids for the capital. So what we have to allocate falls well short of what departments would like to be achieving. And what we have tried to do with the draft budget is obviously we have to fund and try to stabilise the delivery of public services, but we have also tried to apply a PFG lens to that and to try and allocate funding according to the priority areas within the programme for government. So there is a significant allocation to the childcare as one of the priorities. We are proposing to allocate £50 million towards that, which doubles the allocation that was made for this financial year. In relation to social housing or housing new build, which is another one of the items that you mentioned, we have taken an approach whereby with our capital funding available to us, what we have to allocate just about covers the inescapable pressures facing departments. So we are using our RRI strategically to go towards our priority areas of new build housing and investing in our water infrastructure. So that's an approach that we have tried to apply across the board in relation to the draft budget. And obviously departments will be similarly applying that lens to how they utilise their general allocation that is being made in the draft budget as well.
I'll come back in maybe on how we break the cycle, but I suppose in the interests of just trust in the executive and how we buy people into the journey that we're going on, I think there's a real worry about a mismatch in words and actions, because I think we all understand those financial pressures, but when you select in the narrative and in the public facing messages, you pull out issues like childcare and housing as priorities, but they are funded at less than the Barna consequential. You know, we are doing less in these areas than they are in other regions. Do we worry that creates a mismatch and that creates expectations, and we're really not being honest with the public about how you're going to be allocating the funds?
Well, I think it's important also to be honest about the challenges that does face us in relation to setting the budget and the ability to deliver on public services to the level that people expect. And I think it's fair to say that we are falling below expectations in public service delivery, and there are particularly acute areas where that can be very clearly seen in relation to, for example, the pressures that we have seen recently in health, or the pressures that we understand are there in relation to wastewater infrastructure. So as much as possible, we have to get on with the work of trying to stabilise our public services, and that is what we have tried to do over the course of this year with the budget. But again, it is important that we as an executive do have a set of priorities and that we are trying to ensure that they are funded so that we are delivering against those. But I'll be very straight in the fact that is a very significant challenge given the budgetary pressures that we do face. But I think there is an expectation to deliver as well, and so we have to try to achieve that. Joanne, you might want to say something in relation to Barnett consequentials, and I'm not sure, I don't have the table in front of me, in relation to those that came across as specific Barnett this year.
Yes, Minister. The Barnett consequentials we get in a spending review come across at departmental level and aren't broken down by those individual programmes. So at this stage, it'd be very hard for us to say what is being spent on specific things. But it is an issue of competing pressures. There are also issues at the executive fund which we don't get Barnett for, and that has to be taken into account too. For example, victims' pensions. So when you take that in the round, there's no direct read across. For example, if we look at the Barnett consequentials we got for 25-26 in the autumn budget, we don't have a breakdown by programme, but if we look at the consequentials from the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, we actually got a reduction in both our resource and capital DEL for the funding provided to that department, 22.5 million reduction in resource DEL and 5 million reduction in capital DEL. So there's really a wider picture which needs to be taken into account.
I think, as I said, we have sympathy with that, and I believe in devolution and not just cutting and pasting. I suppose my concern is that it's priorities in words, but not necessarily in allocation. And in terms of doing that stabilisation that I think we all understand, I suppose I'm not convinced that is adequately happening. The draft budget says that it's been viewed through the lens of the PFG. The need to maintain existing services until transformation efforts deliver means the level of funding that can be allocated purely on priority is limited, and I think that's what we've just been discussing. I read it as saying public services are so badly run at the moment that any additional funding, goes to that and not to the priorities. But how are we breaking that cycle? I think we heard in the previous session less than 1/3% of the budget is being allocated to transformation. Your top budget official said last week the department has an unprecedented amount of funding this financial year. Should more of that, are we going to break the cycle if more of that is not being allocated to transformation? Because I don't see how we are adequately using the additional cash that we have in this moment.
Well, the top budget official.
I know, I didn't. I think, Joanne, I didn't want to name names, but I'm attributing it directly a quote. Yeah.
The funding that Joanne was referring to was the in-year funding that we received in Barnett consequentials this year, which was just over £900 million. I think that is unprecedented outside of COVID. And I think when you hear what British ministers have said and what the Chancellor has said and other spokespersons about the reset in public services, that the scale of the in-year funding that we received, particularly in October, was indicative of the challenge and the underfunding of public services that we have seen over the past decade and a half, and that talk of a reset. So we don't anticipate receiving similar amounts of money in the next financial year. And when it came to October monitoring round, we received about 630 million in Barnett consequentials in terms of day-to-day spending. We at that point had overspends being projected by departments of 780 million. So in terms of the ability to utilise that for anything other than public service delivery, that was not there. And it has been allocated to try and help departments address their pressures. And within those pressures, of course, is public sector pay. And that's something that we all want to see resolved and progress made on. And I believe progress is being made in relation to that. And we have just completed January monitoring, and at that point, departments were indicating to us still having about 79.3 million of projected over commitments. We only had about 15 million resource to allocate at that point. Obviously, that still leaves departments a little bit short, but my executive colleagues are all committed to living within their budget. So I'm quite confident that that's the position that we are going to be in by the end of the financial year. Very hopeful that the executive will be in a position to deliver a balanced budget in this financial year.
Thank you. Just a quick one to finish. The BMA told us last week that the health sector needs better targeted funding and not necessarily more. Do you agree with that assessment?
I think obviously there are particular pressure areas in the health service, and I'm sure we're all familiar with them through our own constituency offices, as well as all of the representations that we receive from health representatives. And I think that clearly there is a need for transformation within our health service, and I think it is a challenge to be able to deliver that alongside running the health service in itself. Transformation requires investment, but we do need to see those plans coming forward. And we are all very committed to supporting the health minister in doing that. And I'm more than happy to have conversations with him in relation to how we can better target that funding to ensure that we are delivering in relation to that. And I think when you talk about the very acute pressures that we have seen over the course of the past month or so in our health service, and the pressures that are on the workforce, as well as those who are obviously sitting in A&Es and elsewhere waiting on it. So I think it's important that we all pay gratitude to those workers as well, because they are under significant pressure, and in trying to address the pressures and the shortfalls in service delivery. It is about delivering for the people who are dependent on the health service, but it's also trying to help and support those who have to work in the health service as well, and who are doing a very good job under significant pressure.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. David Smith.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, and thank you, Minister, Neil and Joanne, for joining us and for your answers so far. There's been a lot of talk of the level of need in Northern Ireland and the 124%, and there seems to be common agreement that the level of need in Northern Ireland per head is higher than as compared to the average in England. However, the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council's independent analysis has suggested that Northern Ireland is actually receiving more like 125 to 127% per head. So what's the Executive's view on Northern Ireland's level of need?
So I suppose it and the figures that you're quoting in relation to the 125 to 127, it would, I assume, include the financial package that was agreed with the executive upon restoration, and that does just about bring us to need, and maybe just slightly above for this financial year and next financial year. But we were being funded below need in advance of that, and that obviously had an impact on public service delivery. And as has been well documented, there were overspends accrued in the period when the executive wasn't functioning, and that has also had an impact on our ability to deliver public services. So the executive's view, obviously the Fiscal Council has provided very helpful analysis in relation to what potentially our level of need is. The executive's view is there are other factors that should be taken into account in relation to that as well, and that would push our level of need above the 124 level. And as I said in my earlier answers, we are working at the minute to provide that evidence base, and we are working with departments to have appropriate data to support that evidence base, and very very much welcome that Professor Holtham is going to do an independent analysis to help us make that case. Neil, do you want to add anything in relation to that?
Yes, if I may. Just important to say, and it links back a little bit to the previous question, the programme for government. It's all about what's the stable platform from which you would do a journey of transformation. And if I use a rather crude analogy, what we would spend as officials, our energy and time in doing, is very different if what you're preparing for is to go off a cliff, as opposed to what you would do to prepare if you were about to climb a steep mountain. So we have to think about that analysis that says, well, with the financial package, we're above need, but there's no surety of that in the future. So to turn it into practical terms, would you be hiring today AI, data scientists, people to help you think about ways to transform? Or would you be saying, don't recruit anyone because we're going to go off a cliff in 26, 27? So it comes back to this very important fundamental point about having a surety of funding and a reliance on the fact that you will not have to try and operate in a system below any level of objective need, because the harm that that does is not only immediate, it's long-lasting, generational in some cases. And what we've had to try and do here is rely on pots of money or top-up money that will maybe avoid that catastrophe happening. That's not really a very stable platform for us to maybe look at the programme for government, put the energy of officials that I have working for me to bring forward to the executive, to ministers, with a set of transformation ideas or prospects, maybe around those priorities that we've discussed. That's very different to when you're spending most of your time and energy trying to argue and debate whether you just have enough money today. So I think the important point here is about surety and forward sight is absolutely imperative to deliver on a programme for government, and indeed to maximise the benefits from multi-year budgets, which I'm sure we will talk about. It's the surety as well as the actual in-year level. Going back to one of the very first questions, you can say from a perspective we spent at our need because we had an overspend in a previous year. That is no platform for making any strategic decisions about transformation and change when all your energy is trying to negotiate in year. So very much important that we get the funding mechanism and its operation right and correct at the correct level of need to ensure that we're not doing lasting harm.
Thanks, Neil. If I can just I take from your answers, both your answers, Minister, and you know that the executive will be submitting an argument to the UK government that the level of need should be different from 124%. And I hear the point about multi-year funding, and it seems to me that that's the government's plan to move forward across its fiscal approach is multi-year funding. But as you know, in managing any budget, income is important, but so is expenditure. And I just want to ask, do you think that the executive is delivering fiscally efficient departmental budgetary oversight? And if it is, how do the overspends keep happening?
Well, you perhaps will be aware that that the executive recently published a budget sustainability plan. So that was a condition of the financial package, but it was actually a piece of work that we were very happy to do, and a piece of work that we are very keen to build upon. So that set out how we will deliver a balanced budget within this financial year, how we will deliver a balanced budget within the next financial year. We made a number of commitments as an executive as part of the budget sustainability plan, which include, for example, the regular strategic consideration of income generation, include, as we've already talked about, implementation of multi-year budgets where possible. That's something that we think is imperative to give departments and others who access public funding the ability to plan. There's other kind of technical stuff in there that we have committed to doing that will, I suppose, improve the budgetary oversight and promote transparency and accountability. And also, one of your points about overspends, I think the most important thing is that we are properly funded and that we are funded according to our need. But the point that I always make in relation to that is there needs to be proper investment in public services at a British government level. Otherwise, being funded to relative need is only useful if there's enough money going into public services in the first place. And in my opinion, that hasn't been the case over the past decade or so. And one of the other things that the executive has agreed to is to look at a work plan in the future to help secure and maintain sustainable finances. So that's a piece of work that we are currently focusing on. Each department will develop its own 5-year plan about how it will deliver on a sustainable budget. And I think it's a piece of work that, as an executive, we see as necessary, and that will very much tie in with the much needed work in terms of transformation. Neil, you might want to add to that as well. I suppose maybe
if I may,
you're doing around budget improvement plan to try and do things like tie together our budget and the PFG better as well. So Neil might want to speak to some
If I may, Minister, just come in that question. Sorry, Neil, I'm mindful of time, and there's one final question that I really want to ask, and it links to the last point that you just made there, Dr. Archibald, which is, and please, I know this is a big question, so try and give a brief answer if you can, but I'm aware of what I'm asking. In the context of challenging fiscal context for Northern Ireland, but also in the context of, as you said, unprecedented grants outside of COVID from central government. So, there is a lot of money going into Northern Ireland at the moment. Does the very way that the executive is structured help or hinder fiscal efficiency? And just to be absolutely blunt, I'm thinking of the risk of silos in departments, and is that a contributing factor to the overspends that we're seeing and the fiscal sustainability of the executive?
Just on one of your points, as a point of clarity, just in the first instance, when we talked about the unprecedented funding in year, we were referring to the Barnett consequentials that came across. So that was funding that went to other parts as well, to England, to Scotland, and to Wales. In relation to I guess it's our constitutional setup as part of the Good Friday Agreement. Every department and every minister is autonomous. That's the nature of our institutions. Of course, that brings with it challenges, but as an executive, I think where we do what we try to achieve is that we have a collective vision, that we have that program for government that has a set of collective objectives, and that when we are developing things like the draft budget, that we are doing that on a collaborative and collegiate level. Of course, every single one of my executive colleagues will make the case, as I am sure every minister in a department in England will do, as to why their department needs more money and how they need to deliver on their objectives and manifesto commitments. So I think that there's just the nature of any, I suppose, coalition government is that there are going to be challenges in terms of priorities across the board. But I think there is a real focus on us working together to deliver. I think that's a feature of this executive since it has returned, and there is a need to have that kind of sense of collaborative working. But that's a challenge that is ongoing, and I am quite sure will remain.
No further questions.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring in Simon Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, witnesses. Minister, could I ask you this? I'm becoming increasingly encouraged, I have to say, that there seems to be a step change in the MO of the executive, which is building on mutual trust and collaborative working to sort of face into those difficult and challenging political decisions which need to be taken to transform public service and other elements of administration. And I just wondered if you could, just to pick your brains on this particular point, is that a fair assessment as to where things are? And can we sort of relax a little bit that, well, we'll put off difficult, challenging decisions. Somebody somewhere might threaten to destabilise or pull down the executive. The Treasury, Whitehall, to use that Nye Bevan phrase, then stuffs the mouths of people with gold in order to get the thing back up and running. but the fundamental transformation has been dodged because of political instability and lack of trust. I sense that in recent months that there has been a sea change in the thinking, and I really value your either demolition of that proposal or augmentation of it.
I think that I would agree with your assessment. I think that the executive is very committed. I think there's an expectation on us to deliver. And I think that's something that we all feel, that we all know the challenges that faced society when there was no executive, and all of the budgetary challenges that stacked up, and the decisions and inability to move forward in the way that people would expect. So there is clearly, I think, a very clear expectation from the public, and I think as an executive that we are very committed to working together to deliver for people. I think that the programme for government, which had a set of collective objectives, those were things that were quite easily put together, because parties were coming from a very similar place in relation to a lot of those issues, because they are issues that are raised with us on a regular basis. From a budgetary perspective, we are very committed to that stabilisation and transformation. The executive agreed the budget sustainability plan that I had referred to in a previous answer. The executive is collectively committed in relation to that need for transformation, and we have the Public Sector Transformation Board in place, and I hope to have proposals discussed in relation to that at the executive tomorrow. So we are making good progress on a number of areas, and as I say, there is a very collegiate and collaborative environment within the executive, and a willingness and desire to work together and to be able to deliver for the people that we all collectively represent.
Thank you. And just a sort of final follow-up, has that sort of appetite for transformation, and I readily accept your analysis that the public were calling for this as a, for heaven's sake, get on and do it. We've had too much hiatus over the years. Is that appetite now spilling over into to pick up on the latter question of David Smith, in terms of ideas around which the parties can agree about how and when, if you will, to reform some of the structures and constraints in and around the executive formation, how policy is arrived at, etc., in order to, again, sort of underpin executive and wider Stormont stability?
To understand the question that you are asking, is it in relation more to reform of the institutions? Is that what you mean by that?
Yes. In essence, if the wider public sector and public services is undergoing a long overdue process of analysis for transformation opportunities in order to deliver more bang for the buck, better service, etc., is there a concomitant work stream undergoing about how can the executive itself transform, be reformed, etc.? So yes, changes to the institution in the old language, if you will. It was the drive of my question.
Well, I think we're all very cognizant of the why that we have, the constitutional setup that we do, and the need for those protections that are built in to have been built in. But certainly, I think there is a conversation in relation to reform. It's a discussion that certainly I am up for. There is, of course, a mechanism to have that conversation. It's the Assembly and Executive Review Committee. I think there is intention to look via that at the type of reforms potentially that could be taken forward. I think it's important that we have institutions that are fit for purpose. I think that is very important, and that those institutions work in the best interests of the people that we serve. I think the committee should be afforded the space to do what work that it needs to do and to present any proposals. But as I say, there are protections that are built into the Good Friday Agreement, and they are there for a reason. Of course, things evolve over time, but that we just have to strike that balance in ensuring that those are maintained.
Minister, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Dan Aldridge.
Hello. I think we've covered quite a lot of this question. I think I'd just like to ask about what steps the executive has taken with UK government to ensure there's no cliff edge in funding from 2026 to 27.
Yeah, and that's something that I'm very exercised about, and Neil has spoken about in the session as well, in relation to we developed the budget sustainability plan, and it was about balancing our budget and looking forward. The budget sustainability plan that you would put in place if you were going off a cliff, so to speak, it would be very different from the one that we developed, based on the assurances that we had in the interim fiscal framework that we could plan on the assumption that we would be funded at or above the 124 level of need. I think to recognise that we have a level of need and then not to fund us at that level of need would be unconscionable. It would be unacceptable from my perspective that we would go off a cliff in 2026-27, and so it's something that will have my very clear focus in the weeks ahead as we come towards the spending review, to ensure that we are being funded going forward from the next spending review at the appropriate level of need. And as we've already discussed, we are doing that work about determining the actual level of need and to ensuring that we have the evidence base to support that.
Thank you. Just for my clarity, I suppose. I think I'm aware of where the work the executive's done. I think it's the link between what the executive has done with UK government, and just what steps are there really, and if there's anything we can help with, I suppose.
So there has been ongoing engagement between my department officials and Treasury officials, and between myself and the CST. So there is an awareness that there is a next step to the interim fiscal framework in terms of that level of need conversation. There is a commitment written in to the interim fiscal framework that those concerns about the 2026-27 and beyond level of need would be addressed at the appropriate spending review, which is the one coming up now in June. So there is a very clear path of work that is being undertaken in relation to that between both the executive and the British government.
Is there anywhere where we can look at what that looks like in terms? Is there a document that kind of explains a bit more about what that course of work looks like, so we can kind of get a sense of what magnitude that is? Or I'm just really interested, really, about what that looks like, because I think from a transparency perspective rather than anything else.
I think that. We have obviously the interim fiscal framework, which I'm sure that that you will have, which sets out what had been agreed and the kind of next steps in terms of a final fiscal framework. So that would be one thing to refer to. Obviously, there's ongoing negotiations between the Department of Finance and Treasury. So I suppose it would be difficult to provide anything in that space, I suppose, until we're closer to a conclusion in relation to some of that work. And I think, just to suppose in relation to, you talked about support. For example, there is some clarity required in the course of that negotiation. For example, you will be aware about how agriculture funding was unring-fenced for the devolved administrations in the budget for next year. How that's treated in our level of need calculation is something that needs to be worked out. I think Robert Choate referred to that as well in relation to his evidence session. So there's work ongoing, and there is a pace to that work because there is a very clear and tight deadline in relation to it.
Minister, if I may add to that, just also I think it would be useful to give the committee some reassurance that it relies on a fairly small team, both in Treasury and indeed here, in terms of that engagement But just to put on record, those are tremendously strong relationships built over a very long period of time. Joanne on my side and many colleagues in Treasury, and I certainly have no concerns at the either competency of officials of both sides working on or the dedication to work together. So I certainly have no complaints about the level of engagement at that, looking at the analysis and data. Now it's going to ramp up a bit, but we have tremendous working relationships with our Treasury colleagues. It's quite a niche area, so it's not a huge team of people on either side, but very, very strong working relationships between the two groups of officials.
Very helpful, thank you.
Hey, Dr. Al Pinkerton.
Thank you very much, Chair. My questions are going to be about revenue raising. And I recognise that this is a sensitive and challenging issue. Clearly the Executive's fiscal framework includes a target of generating 113 million in additional revenue by April 2026, and the Secretary of State has made it very clear to this committee here that raising that money, or money close to it, was one of the conditions of the Executive's restoration funding package. So my question to you is, what plans does the Executive have to introduce further local revenue raising measures?
Well, I suppose just firstly on the condition point, it was a condition to write off the overspend, and I guess as an executive we would have said there should have been no conditions attached to that, because the overspend was accrued while we were being funded below need. However, Treasury took a different view. We were able to get flexibility. Initially they had wanted that 113 million raised in this financial year. That was something, given the limited fiscal levers available to us, the only option would have been to put up domestic and non-domestic rates by 15%, which is something that would have been counterproductive in my view, and I wasn't prepared to do it. So we were able to negotiate that with Treasury. We have made very good progress in relation to that. We have raised over 80 million additional this financial year, and we will be projected to hit, I think it is 129.4 million in the next financial year, or collectively over those 2 years. So we will hit that target. I would be quite confident in relation to that. I suppose I would say in the kind of broader issue of revenue raising, the Executive does have very limited fiscal levers at our disposal. That does present a challenge, and for me it's very important that where we do try to generate income, and we have committed as part of the budget sustainability plan to do those strategic reviews of income generation, that we are looking at doing that in a progressive way, that we are trying to do it as fairly and equitably as possible, that it isn't just about putting charges on people for services that they already receive. That does present a challenge to us as an executive, but clearly given the demands in terms of our budget and the desire for us as an executive to deliver high quality public services, it is something that we do need to look at. So like the willingness to do that is there. It's the how that we do it, and that we don't put more pain and pressure on people who aren't in a position to afford to pay, and that we don't take decisions that are counterproductive and that would damage our tax base and do damage to businesses. And the makeup of our economy, I suppose, would be very, very different to that in England. And so that's something that we are very conscious of in terms of the decisions that we are taking as well.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that question.
All I would add to that is both to echo the Minister's point about the very different structural nature of the economy, both in the sectors that this particular part of the UK specialises in, but also in its tax base itself. And that crude instrument that is rates has a very particular sectoral mix within it as well, meaning that decisions in that area have particular impacts on sectors such as retailing, tourism, etc. So as Minister said, it needs very careful consideration, but it's also worth drawing attention to why it also matters to make those small, which may seem very limited in overall fiscal terms, changes or tweaks. We need to bring as officials lots of ideas and suggestions forwards. Even minor changes or tweaks can also play an important part in maintaining the progressive nature that the Minister has spoken of, but also help that journey of change and transformation within civic society, where there is that recognition that reliefs need to be reviewed or any measure should be considered fully, even if it's a small amount. And I think it's actually a good reflection on the executive thus far that there are a suite of smaller measures so that it hasn't been simply around that one crude instrument, because as Minister said, there are very limited tools for significant revenue raising. So structural difference, but also considering every measure, however small, is an important part of the work stream.
Thank you, Mr Gibson, and thank you, Dr Archibald, for those answers. And both of you have alluded to the fact that the Northern Ireland Executive have, as you've characterised it, limited levers, limited options for revenue raising. So I suppose that does raise for me the question, would you advocate for more levers, to access to more levers in the same way that Scotland and Wales might have, for example, varying levels of income tax, for example, or tax on like stamp duty, for example, varying stamp duty. Are those things that you would be helpful to you? What impact do you think they could have in closing this fiscal gap that you have? And do the institutions of Northern Ireland have the capacity to take on those additional functions? And indeed, what else would the institutions need in order to deliver those?
Yeah, so that is a piece of work that we are keen to progress as well. It is written into the interim fiscal framework that we will look at the principles of fiscal devolution. My predecessor, Conor Murphy, when he was Finance Minister, set up a fiscal commission which reported in May 2022, and it did make recommendations about fiscal powers that would be potential candidates for devolution. So officials in my department are taking forward that piece of work as well. As Neil referred to earlier, we do have quite a small fiscal team, and their focus in the immediacy has been in relation to the level of need work. But this is also an important piece of work, and as you referred to, there would be some tools, I suppose, and principles that would be required to be negotiated out to support the devolution of any additional powers, including, for example, budgetary management tools. So that is going to be, I suppose, the next iteration of the work in relation to the fiscal framework. I suppose it would be incumbent on me to say that there will be different political views in relation to the devolution of fiscal powers. I would be very much in the camp of advocating for them. Others might not be quite in that place. So we as an executive will have to take a position in relation to that as well. But it is an area of work that I am certainly keen to progress, because I do see it as giving us the ability to generate income, but also to direct and to achieve policy objectives, which I think is just as important.
Minister, if I may add to that, I think obviously any devolution and policy decisions are inherently political. But what's important, I think, reflecting on some earlier comments, is having that programme for government, a look towards multi-year planning and budget cycles, and indeed the work we're doing on the sustainability plan for and under that programme of work for Minister, is to look long term, because I think once you have a strategic direction and you know exactly what you're aiming at, what type of services you aspire to deliver, what quantum of funding you might get under a more stable funding formula, you can look at what that differential is and ask a strategic question about the level of transformation and change that you can do to drive that closing of that gap, and potentially what revenue raising. In other words, revenue raising isn't in itself the goal. The goal is to try and deliver the kind of quality services that citizens demand and expect. And I think that's much better done with the type of long-term strategic thinking that Minister has been talking about in her drive towards multi-year budgets, long-term 5-year sustainability plans around different department spending trajectories. So it should be considered in that delivering services aspect rather than as to meet a commitment of closing a gap. I think that's much more likely to get the kind of civic engagement and support for such a change.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I know that the committee will be very keen to follow up on a few issues and write to you as well. But can I say thank you very much for your time, and I'll call the meeting to a close. Order.